The airfield is quiet now. Somewhere in occupied Europe, 1943, a winter wind moves across concrete scored by tire marks and oil stains. A German fighter sits at rest, its engine cowling open. Mechanics lean in close, studying fragments recovered from a downed American aircraft. Twisted metal, burned fittings, a data plate still legible beneath soot. What draws their attention is not the damage, but the precision. The tolerances are tight, the machining is clean. The engine had kept running even after taking hits. Later, in an intelligence office far from the runway, reports circulate. Aircraft production figures, factory photographs, interrogation summaries. Somewhere in the margins, a detail repeats itself, quietly at first, then impossible to ignore. The engines powering these American fighters, engines now appearing in growing numbers over Germany, were not built by the skilled male industrial workforce German planners expected. They were built by women. For pilots trained to believe that industrial strength flowed from rigid hierarchy and traditional labor, the realization is unsettling. The sky is no longer just a battlefield. It is a scoreboard. In every passing month suggests that something fundamental has been misunderstood. That misunderstanding begins long before the first engine ever left the factory floor.
In September 1939, war returned to Europe with a violence that felt both sudden and inevitable. German forces crossed into Poland with a coordination and speed that stunned observers. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry moved as a single organism. The concept of blitzkrieg was not yet a word known to the public, but its effects were unmistakable. Within weeks, Poland collapsed. Within months, Denmark and Norway followed. By the summer of 1940, France, long considered Europe's greatest land power, was defeated. Behind these victories stood the Luftwaffe. German air power had not simply supported ground operations, it had shaped them. Dive bombers cleared roads and bridges, fighters controlled airspace, medium bombers disrupted communications and morale. To German planners, air superiority was not a goal, it was an assumption. This confidence extended beyond tactics and aircraft design. It reached deep into ideology. Nazi Germany viewed war as a test of national character. Strength, discipline, and hierarchy were not just military values, they were social ones. Industrial labor followed the same logic. Skilled male workers, organized under strict supervision, were seen as the only reliable foundation for advanced manufacturing. Precision work, especially aircraft engines, was considered unsuitable for women. The regime's vision of femininity emphasized motherhood and domestic stability, not factory floors. As Germany rearmed through the 1930s, women were deliberately excluded from heavy industry wherever possible. When labor shortages appeared, they were filled with conscripted workers from occupied territories, prisoners of war, and later, forced laborers brought from across Europe. The ideological line held. German women were not to be the backbone of weapons production. This belief shaped German expectations of their enemies. The United States, in particular, was underestimated. To German analysts in the late 1930s, America was wealthy but unfocused. Its military was small. Its society was consumer-oriented. Its industry, though large, was fragmented across civilian markets. The idea that such a nation could rapidly retool for total war seemed doubtful. More importantly, American social norms, perceived as lax and individualistic, were seen as incompatible with the disciplined mobilization Germany believed modern war required. Even as wars spread, the United States remained officially neutral. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke of preparedness, but Congress and the public resisted full commitment. The American military ranked far below European powers in size. Aircraft production lagged behind Germany and Britain. In 1939, the U.S. produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. Germany produced more than twice that number. From Berlin, the conclusion seemed obvious. If Britain fell, and if the Soviet Union could be contained, the United States would remain distant, economically influential, but militarily irrelevant. German planners believed they understood the limits of American power because they believed they understood American society. They were wrong. The first cracks in this assumption appeared not in combat, but in contracts and blueprints. As early as 1940, American factories began expanding, new assembly lines were planned, engine designs were refined. Companies like Pratt Whitney, Wright Aeronautical, and Allison Engine Company received orders that dwarfed anything in their peacetime history. Still, to German intelligence, these developments appeared slow and disorganized. Reports emphasized bottlenecks, labor disputes, and political debate. America, they believed, lacked the unity required for sustained industrial warfare. What they could not see, what no aerial reconnaissance could reveal, was a transformation taking place inside the factory walls, a transformation that would not only fill those assembly lines, but redefine who stood beside them. By the time the first American-built engines began crossing the Atlantic in large numbers, the assumptions formed in Berlin were already obsolete, and yet they would persist until the evidence appeared in the sky itself. The next stage of this story unfolds not in Europe, but across an ocean, in a nation preparing, quietly at first, for a war it could no longer avoid.
On the morning of December 7, 1941, the distance between Europe and the United States collapsed. Pearl Harbor ended the debate that had dominated American politics for 2 years. Isolation was no longer an option. Within hours, the United States was at war. Within days, its industrial system was placed on a footing unmatched in modern history. The challenge was immediate and severe. America did not lack raw materials or factory space. It lacked time and people. By the end of 1941, millions of American men were entering military service. Others were already tied to critical infrastructure: railroads, mining, shipyards, logistics. Aircraft manufacturing, especially engine production, demanded a workforce that could not simply be pulled from the remaining civilian pool. The machines were complex, the tolerances unforgiving. A single mistake inside an engine block could destroy an aircraft at altitude. Yet the demand was relentless. The U.S. Army Air Forces projected losses in the thousands. Britain required engines for its own aircraft. The Soviet Union, now fighting for survival, needed materiel at an unprecedented scale. Engine plants ran day and night, but orders continued to outpace output. The solution emerged not from improvisation, but from policy. In early 1942, the War Production Board issued directives that fundamentally altered American labor practices. Restrictions on female employment in heavy industry were lifted. Training programs were funded. Factories were redesigned for new workflows. Safety equipment was modified. Entire production lines were reorganized around the reality that a significant portion of the workforce would be women, many with no prior industrial experience. This was not a symbolic shift, it was structural. Aircraft engines represented some of the most demanding manufacturing tasks of the war. Radial engines, like the Pratt Whitney R2800, contained thousands of individual components. Each required precise machining, heat treatment, inspection, and assembly. Inline engines, such as the Allison V1710, demanded exact alignment and careful calibration. These were not tasks easily automated in the 1940s. They depended on human hands and trained eyes. Women filled those roles. They learned to read blueprints, to operate lathes and milling machines, to measure tolerances in thousandths of an inch. In many plants, they outperformed expectations. Absenteeism was lower than predicted. Error rates declined as experience accumulated. Supervisors, initially skeptical, began requesting more female workers rather than fewer. The scale was staggering. By 1943, women made up more than half the workforce in some aircraft engine plants. Nationwide, over 2 million women worked directly in war manufacturing. They were not limited to auxiliary roles. They built crankshafts, cylinder heads, magnetos, and superchargers. They assembled engines that would power fighters, bombers, and transports across every theater of the war. Government messaging kept pace with reality. Posters and newsreels presented images of confident, capable women in coveralls standing beside engines larger than themselves. But behind the propaganda was something quieter and more consequential: consistency. Engines built in California matched those built in Connecticut. Parts produced in Indiana fit assemblies completed in New York. Interchangeability, the foundation of American mass production, held under pressure. Engines left factories by the tens of thousands. They crossed the Atlantic in crates. They were installed in aircraft at depots in Britain and North Africa. Pilots climbed into cockpits, trusting machines they had never seen assembled by hands they would never know. And they worked. By late 1942, German pilots began encountering American aircraft with unsettling regularity. Fighters that could stay aloft longer, bombers that absorbed damage and returned home, escorts whose engines did not fail under sustained stress. The shift was not immediately understood. At first, it was attributed to luck or isolated technical improvements. But as losses mounted, German intelligence sought explanations beyond tactics alone. They turned to production. Photographs were examined, reports were cross-referenced, captured documents were translated. Slowly, a picture formed, one that contradicted deeply held beliefs about labor, society, and war. The engines filling the skies over Europe were not just products of American industry, they were products of an industrial culture willing to redefine itself under fire. And that redefinition would soon confront Germany in ways no aircraft design or battlefield maneuver could counter.
The workday began before sunrise. Factory whistles cut through cold air as buses arrived from neighborhoods and rural roads alike. Inside the plants, the smell of oil and hot metal never faded. Machines started and did not stop for 10, sometimes 12 hours. For many of the women who stepped onto those factory floors, this was a new world. Some had come from offices, others from farms or homes. Few had touched industrial machinery before the war. Training was compressed into weeks. There was no margin for hesitation. An engine part incorrectly machined could cost a life thousands of feet above the ground. They learned quickly. Hands grew steady, movements became precise. Women operated drill presses, grinders, and lathes with practiced confidence. They inspected parts with micrometers and gauges, recording measurements with care. Quality control was not an abstract concept, it was personal. Many had brothers, husbands, or sons overseas. The engines they built were not anonymous machines, they were lifelines. Fatigue was constant, the noise was relentless, yet production targets were met and then exceeded. Supervisors noted patterns, teams stabilized, output increased without sacrificing accuracy. The factories became ecosystems of repetition and trust. By 1943, the novelty had faded. What remained was professionalism. These women were no longer substitutes, they were specialists. The engines they assembled moved onward, crated, shipped, installed, until they became part of something larger, something violent, something decisive. And far above these factory floors, in thin air over Europe, those engines would soon be judged. In the Second World War, the engine was the aircraft. Airframes could be damaged, control surfaces could be shot through, but if the engine failed, nothing else mattered. American aircraft doctrine placed extraordinary emphasis on engine reliability. Fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang were built around power plants capable of sustained performance at altitude. Bombers, such as the B-17 and B-24, depended on engines that could run for hours under strain, absorbing damage and still bringing crews home. This philosophy demanded manufacturing discipline. Parts had to be interchangeable across thousands of units.
Maintenance crews in the field relied on consistent tolerances. A magneto produced in one plant had to function perfectly with an engine assembled hundreds of miles away. Women on the production line became part of that system. Their work fed directly into an operational doctrine that assumed engines would not quit. German pilots began to notice American aircraft did not break off engagements as quickly as they might expected. Damage that might cripple other aircraft was sometimes endured. This was not invincibility. Losses were heavy, but reliability altered the balance. Every engine that kept running extended a mission. Every mission completed eroded German defenses. What appeared in the sky as tactical persistence was, in truth, the result of decisions made months earlier on factory floors. And those decisions had been guided by leadership willing to prioritize output over ideology. The mobilization of women into engine production was not accidental. It was authorized, encouraged, and defended at the highest levels. The Roosevelt administration understood that the war would be won or lost on production curves. The War Production Board tracked output daily. Bottlenecks were identified and attacked. When skilled labor ran short, the question was not whether women could fill the gap. It was how fast they could be trained. There were doubts. Engineers worried about turnover. Managers feared inefficiency. Politicians worried about backlash. But the data told a different story. As women gained experience, productivity rose. Absenteeism dropped. Safety incidents declined as procedures standardized. Leadership adapted. Plants invested in training rather than replacement. Childcare solutions were explored. Shifts were adjusted. The system bent instead of breaking. These were not ideological victories. They were practical ones. Engines were leaving factories faster than Germany could destroy them. And somewhere inside captured reports and pilot debriefings, German analysts began encountering a pattern they had not anticipated, one that challenged not just enemy strength, but their own assumptions. That confrontation between belief and evidence would sharpen as the war intensified.
The first hints appeared in technical summaries. Recovered engine fragments were cataloged and compared, serial numbers traced to factories, production rates estimated. What troubled German analysts was not a single innovation, but consistency. The same machining standards appeared across multiple plants. Repairs on captured aircraft revealed interchangeable parts that fit without modification. Intelligence officers sought explanations. Sabotage was ruled out. Espionage could not account for scale. The conclusion pointed back to labor, and there, the evidence conflicted with doctrine. Interrogations of captured Allied personnel added fragments of clarity. Factory photographs circulated through analysis units. Some were dismissed as propaganda. Others were harder to ignore. Women standing beside engine blocks. Women operating precision equipment. Women signing inspection tags. For Luftwaffe pilots, the idea was difficult to reconcile with experience. They were facing aircraft whose engines endured prolonged combat stress, yet the machines were supposedly built by a workforce Germany considered unsuitable for such tasks. This disbelief did not remain abstract. It became personal. Pilots returning from missions described American fighters that stayed with them through extended climbs, bombers that refused to fall apart. Reliability translated into survival for the enemy. By late 1943, the tone of reports shifted. Skepticism gave way to reluctant acknowledgement. America's production system was not just large, it was resilient, and it was built on assumptions Germany had never tested. Nazi ideology had drawn clear boundaries around gender and labor. Those boundaries now collided with the empirical evidence of war. Germany's own production system was under strain. Bombing disrupted factories. Skilled workers were pulled into combat roles. Forced labor filled gaps, but lacked training, stability, and motivation. Quality suffered. Output fluctuated. In contrast, American production expanded even under pressure. When one plant reached capacity, another absorbed demand. When labor ran short, policy adjusted. The system prioritized function over form. For German planners, this was more than an industrial disadvantage. It was a philosophical one. Their model of war assumed social rigidity produced strength. The battlefield suggested otherwise. The skies over Europe became a testing ground, not just for aircraft, but for belief systems. Engines built by women continued to arrive in growing numbers. They did not represent novelty or exception. They represented a new normal. And as the air war escalated into its most destructive phase, that normal would become decisive. The turning point was approaching, not measured in speeches or declarations, but in attrition rates, production charts, and empty airfields.
By early 1943, the air war over Europe entered a new phase. The scale changed, the tempo accelerated, and for the first time, German planners confronted a reality they could no longer rationalize away. American bomber formations began appearing deep over the Reich, not isolated raids, but sustained campaigns, day after day, week after week. Factories, rail yards, oil facilities. Targets once considered unreachable were now routine destinations. At first, the Luftwaffe responded with confidence. Fighter units rose to meet the bombers. Interceptions were fierce. Losses on both sides were heavy. But beneath the chaos of dogfights, a quieter metric told a different story. American aircraft kept coming back. Bombers returned with engines shot through, cylinders damaged, oil leaking. Maintenance crews patched them, replaced parts, and sent them up again. Engines held together long enough to complete missions that German planners expected to fail mid-air. Reliability did not eliminate losses, but it reduced them enough to change the equation. The introduction of long-range escort fighters accelerated the shift. The P-47 Thunderbolt, powered by the Pratt Whitney R-2800, could absorb punishment and still fight its way home. Later, the P-51 Mustang, paired with the Packard-built Merlin engine, transformed the air war entirely. Escorts no longer turned back at the edge of Germany, they stayed. German pilots noticed immediately. Engagements grew longer. Altitude advantages disappeared. Retreat became more dangerous than attack. The engine, once a limiting factor, was now an advantage held by the enemy. Behind every one of those engines stood production figures Germany could not match. American factories were producing aircraft engines by the tens of thousands annually. Losses were replaced faster than they could be inflicted. Each downed aircraft was not a strategic victory, it was a statistical inconvenience. German intelligence assessments grew increasingly stark. Attrition rates among experienced pilots climbed. Training pipelines could not compensate. Fuel shortages worsened. Spare parts became scarce. The Luftwaffe was fighting two wars at once, one in the sky and one against an enemy production system that showed no sign of exhaustion. And within that system, women continued to fill engine plants, shifts running around the clock, output climbing even as bombing intensified overseas. By mid-1944, the imbalance was visible from the air. Fewer German fighters rose to intercept. Those that did were often flown by less experienced pilots. Engines failed more often. Maintenance standards slipped under pressure. The sky, once contested, began to empty. This was not a single battle. It was a cumulative collapse, engine by engine, sortie by sortie. And as the realization set in, German commanders faced a truth they could not reverse. The turning point had passed. What remained was to understand how completely it had done so. By the summer of 1944, German leadership no longer spoke in terms of recovery. Internal memoranda abandoned optimism. The language became clinical, defensive. Numbers replaced rhetoric.
Reports from the Reich Air Ministry acknowledged what pilots had been reporting for months. American aircraft availability remained high despite sustained losses. Sortie rates did not decline after major engagements. In some sectors, they increased. The expected effect of attrition never arrived. The reason was no longer in doubt. Captured documents and industrial assessments confirmed that American engine production far exceeded German capacity. More unsettling was how that production was sustained. Even under maximum military demand, American factories maintained consistency. Engines arrived standardized, interchangeable, and reliable. The workforce behind them did not collapse under pressure. It stabilized. German planners understood what this meant. The war in the air was no longer being decided by tactics alone. It was being decided by replacement velocity, by how quickly one side could absorb losses and return strength to the field. Germany could not. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Pilot training hours were reduced. New airframes waited for engines that never arrived. Experienced mechanics were lost to bombing or reassigned. Forced labor could not compensate for the loss of skilled hands. Quality declined further, accelerating the cycle. Meanwhile, American engine plants continued operating at scale. Women worked double shifts. Inspection protocols tightened. Output curves climbed even as the war reached its most destructive phase. There was no dramatic announcement of victory, only the steady continuation of work. For German pilots, the change was unmistakable. Missions launched with fewer aircraft. Encounters ended quickly, often one-sided. The sky felt larger, emptier, more dangerous. Engines failed where they once held. Confidence eroded. In private correspondence, some officers acknowledged the broader failure. They had underestimated the enemy's capacity to adapt, not just technologically, but socially. The belief that industrial strength required rigid hierarchy had proven false. Flexibility had won. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, air superiority was no longer contested. It was assumed. German aircraft rarely appeared in force. When they did, they were overwhelmed. The turning point had not occurred in a single engagement. It had unfolded quietly, invisibly, in factories far from the front, where engines were built faster than they could be destroyed. And when the war on the ground began its final phase, the consequences of that imbalance were already irreversible. What followed was not sudden collapse, but reckoning.
When the fighting began to subside in Europe, the evidence of imbalance was everywhere. Airfields stood littered with grounded aircraft. Some were intact but unusable. Others had been cannibalized for parts that never arrived. Hangars echoed with absence rather than activity. The numbers told the story with uncomfortable clarity. By the end of the war, the United States had produced well over 300,000 military aircraft and hundreds of thousands of aircraft engines. German production, disrupted by bombing, shortages, and labor instability, never approached replacement parity after 1943. Losses in experienced Luftwaffe pilots could not be offset by accelerated training. Engine reliability gaps compounded every other weakness. American aircraft, though not invulnerable, demonstrated a statistical advantage. More aircraft returned from missions damaged but operational. More engines completed their service life. More sorties were flown per airframe. These were not dramatic differences in isolation. Together, they reshaped the air war. German intelligence post-war assessments acknowledged this reality. The Allied advantage, they concluded, lay not in a single aircraft or tactic, but in industrial endurance. Production absorbed losses faster than combat could inflict them. Within that endurance sat the contribution of women, quantifiable, undeniable, and often unacknowledged at the time. In engine plants alone, hundreds of thousands of women had filled roles previously considered unattainable. They had maintained output under pressure, often while managing households, rationing, and constant uncertainty. The effect extended beyond Europe. The same engines powered aircraft in the Pacific, across North Africa, and over the Atlantic. Reliability shortened wars of distance. It expanded operational reach. As Allied armies advanced, the skies above them remained largely uncontested. Ground forces moved with confidence. Logistics flowed uninterrupted. Air superiority, once a contested achievement, became an assumed condition. This assumption would shape the final months of the war and the world that followed. But the end of fighting did not mark the end of consequences. For those who had built the engines, a different transition was about to begin.
Victory did not arrive with celebration alone. It arrived with uncertainty. As contracts ended and production slowed, engine plants that had run non-stop for years began to quiet. Machines powered down, assembly lines halted. The urgency that had defined daily life receded almost overnight. For many women who had built aircraft engines, the transition was abrupt. They had mastered complex tasks, earned steady wages, and carried responsibility that mattered. Now they were told, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, that their work was finished. Men returned from the war, labor priorities shifted, government messaging changed tone. The same posters that once celebrated women in factories now emphasize domestic stability and peacetime normalcy. In many cases, women were encouraged or required to leave the jobs they had proven capable of performing. The engines they built, however, did not disappear. American aircraft remained in service across the world. Engine designs, refined during wartime, became the foundation of post-war aviation. Commercial air travel expanded using technologies perfected under pressure. Manufacturing standards developed during the war became permanent expectations. Quietly, the industrial lessons endured. German post-war analysis reinforced the conclusion drawn too late during the conflict. The war had been lost not just in battle, but in assumptions. Ideology had constrained flexibility. Production systems that could not adapt had failed under sustained pressure. For the women who had filled those engine plants, recognition came unevenly. Some found new opportunities in post-war industry. Others returned to roles they had once left behind. Their contribution remained, for decades, underrepresented in official narratives. Yet the historical record is unambiguous. Aircraft engines that powered decisive campaigns were built at scale by a workforce that defied pre-war expectations. Those engines altered air superiority, shortened conflicts, and reshaped strategic outcomes. The factories may have gone silent, but their impact continued, embedded in the machines that had already changed the course of history. All that remained was to understand what that change truly meant. The war ended, but its lessons lingered in quiet, often overlooked ways. Victory was not won solely by generals or pilots, but by decisions made far from the front lines, in factories humming with relentless activity. The hands that assembled engines, the eyes that inspected each part, the steady rhythm of work under pressure, these were the forces that shaped the sky. The American industrial system proved something fundamental. Flexibility can surpass rigid tradition. Ideology, even when deeply held, could not compete with competence and adaptability. German assumptions about who could build, who could endure, and what society could achieve were overturned not in a single battle, but through thousands of unglamorous, unseen acts of labor. The engines themselves became symbols of this shift. They carried lives, firepower, and the unexpected lesson that a workforce underestimated by the enemy could tip the balance of war.
Every P-51 Mustang and B-17 Flying Fortress that returned from missions intact was a testament to human diligence, skill, and quiet determination. In the end, the story of women in American engine plants is not just a footnote in history. It is a reminder that warfare is not decided solely by the strength of arms, but by the capacity of societies to adapt, innovate, and trust competence wherever it is found. The sky was the final judge, but the factories, filled with women who had never imagined themselves shaping history, were the true arbiters. What mattered most was not ideology, not tradition, not expectation. It was the work, consistent and precise, that transformed possibility into reality. And in that transformation, history itself shifted, engine by engine, life by life, mission by mission.